So, without further ado, I'm just going to say a brief word about Mindroom and then get into the talk itself. Let me also say thank you to all of you for gathering this morning. I know an hour and a half is, you know, a chunk of time out of your day, but I'm really glad you can be here. There is no question that neurodiversity is in the mainstream now, and thank goodness, because we've been campaigning for that for 25 years. And so, you know, whenever you are starting or accelerating your journey, I hope you'll find something of value in this guide today. I mentioned that Mindroom is 25 years old, and ever since the start of the organization, we have been supporting neurodivergent people and families, and doing so both in a direct support basis, also advising and supporting employers, and then through research and policy, we've been influencing change at a systemic level as well. As many of you will know, around 1 in 5 is neurodivergent. That includes me and some of our panelists as well today. And we've all had very varying experiences of what neuroinclusion does look like in the workplace when you get it right, but also what we can do to create more inclusive workplaces as well. So it follows that if that's 1 in 5 of us, our workplaces have lots of neurodivergent individuals already working within your organizations, within your value chains, within your customer base as well. And we are slowly designing better environments for everybody. It's maybe a little bit flippant to say this, but any changes and improvements we make at a workplace level from a neuroinclusion point of view, generally speaking, are good for everybody. So why wouldn't we do that? And the goal ultimately is something we call universal design. Design in for all in the first place, and it makes life so much easier. So when we talk about neuroinclusion, I see that as just enabling everybody to thrive. So how can you remove barriers? How can you help people lean into their innate skills, talents, and capabilities so that we can all make the most effective contribution possible? It makes lots of practical sense, but we have a society in which we conform to, and we have a particular worldview. And yet the irony is the brain is just like a fingerprint. There are no two brains the same. So we are designed perfectly as we are. That comes with lots of strengths, and we are a strengths-based organization. But it does also mean there are things that can be more challenging, and we're not shying away from that. So this guide will set out today a little bit about each of the 3 big themes that I talked about: leadership, psychological safety, and inclusive culture. And as I say, you will have a copy of that as well. This is not a commitment or a pledge or a charter of any of those things. It is simply a guide. You can start where you are. If you're already far down a path, I'm sure there will still be value and relevance in this for you. If you're just starting out, then there is a really good framework for you to start to look at this in more depth and go at a pace that works for you. You'd expect me to say so. We can help and support with that, but this is not a sales pitch today. Just a couple of housekeeping things before I pass on to Helene. And that is, you can post questions in the chat. They will be to the open forum here. Nelly will moderate that, and she will point us to any questions that we can answer today. If there's anything we don't get to, we will look to answer that after this call. There is also a Q&A function. So if you do want to speak to us privately about any topic, then feel free to use that as well. So that's just a little bit from me by way of opening. I'm now going to ask Helene to speak to the genesis of this guide, where it came from, how did we arrive at this moment, who was involved in it as well. So Helene, I'll pass over to you, please.
Oh, thank you so much, Alan. And I'm so happy to be here and see so many attending. Wow, amazing. And I really look forward to listen to the discussion and the presentations coming up as well. So my name is Helene Öberg, and I am the Secretary General of the Swedish Prince Couples Foundation. And our main focuses are on dyslexia and safety online. And the Prince Couples Foundation was founded 10 years ago by the Swedish prince couple, Prince Carl Philip and Princess Sofia, when they got married. It was actually in June, so it's about 10 years exactly since then. We're celebrating a jubilee this year. And their vision was to create a society where all children and young people feel secure, valued, and empowered to reach their full potential. And over the years, we have worked to raise awareness and drive change in areas that are often overlooked. And we find neurodiversity as one of them. And we have done some different collaborations connected to neurodiversity. And one collaboration that we really are so happy about and value really high is with Salvesen Mindroom Centre. And that began after a colleague of mine attended the conference, It Takes All Kinds of Minds in Edinburgh. And we were deeply inspired by Mindroom's holistic approach. Their focus on children, families, and human experience in a world that can often feel overly clinical, especially if you have yourself some challenges or you have children with challenges. In November 2023, we co-hosted a roundtable on neurodiversity in the workplace. It was a really powerful moment, bringing together leaders from businesses, government, and academia from both Sweden and Scotland. And the goal was clear: to move from why to how, from awareness to action. And we discussed the economic and social value of inclusion, the importance of psychological safety, and the need for leadership that embraces difference. Inclusion starts with understanding that trust and openness are essential, and that must challenge outdated recruitment practices. And yes, while we should never reduce a person's worth to numbers, the economic cost of exclusion is real. We lose billions, but not allowing people to be themselves. And as the mother of a daughter who will take her exam and make her first steps into to workplaces herself coming months, she's autistic, I also found the co-creative approach of this guide very important. And that is, we will learn more about how this guide is made. But for me, in a personal level, it's really important. And I think as a strategic view of how to work with inclusion and neurodiversity, co-creation is really essential. We need to listen and include neurodivergent perspectives and their needs to ensure that workplaces and material are really inclusive, not only in paper, but also in reality. Looking ahead, we believe in a future where neurodiversity is not just accommodated, but celebrated, with workplaces that are designed for all minds and where no one is left behind. And for us in the Prince Couples Foundation, our next step is the launch of a research overview of dyslexia, which we make to raise the knowledge and understanding about dyslexia, and especially in schools, but we will also address parents as well. And I look so much forward to share that research overview with all of you in the next month. So I would already like to say thank you for everyone to attending, to share, to contribute to this guide and this launch. And also would like to underline the need and necessary of having an ongoing conversation where we together can keep building a world where every mind matters. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Helene. I appreciate that. You mentioned co-creation, and that's been really important here. Yes, that's been with employers both across Scotland, the UK, and Sweden, and globally for that matter. But critically, it's been built with and by neurodivergent people, not just employees, parents, carers. Young people have been involved in the creation of this as well. So it wasn't just something that was dreamed up as here's things you should do. This came directly from people who are neurodivergent, saying these are the things that would empower me to flourish, and here are ways in which you can really tackle that. And so with that, let us now get into the big three themes that we have arrived at in this guide. And the first of which I'm going to speak to is with Paul Mawson, and that is leadership. So Paul, I wonder if you could come in and give your thoughts on that, please.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks to everyone at Mindroom for including me in the panel today. One of the things that always strikes me about Mindroom is its focus on lived experience, which really chimes with my own values. I'm gonna come to where I'm at later on in terms of introducing who I am. I'm going to start by talking about leadership. Only when attitudes change at the most senior levels of an organisation can you really affect culture change. You can have the most well-meaning steering groups led by fantastic colleagues, but if the behaviour isn't being modelled properly by your senior leadership team, if that group of colleagues is not being supported, then there's a limit to how far it can go. So leadership is essential. It's not a byproduct. It's not something that is nice to have. It is most definitely a need to have. This is more, though, than just having an exec sponsor of a neuroinclusion group. We see this all the time. It's also more than somebody taking it on because of their own neurodivergent experience, whether that's personal or a family or a friend. Because what we can sometimes see is that people come in and think there is a certain way that somebody with autism or ADHD will behave, and everyone is different. And I really like what Alan just said about the brain is like a fingerprint. There is no two that are identical. We need leaders that are going to walk and talk and behave the values that you want to see grow across the organisation. And that needs to genuinely embrace the diversity of minds, which includes our neurotypical colleagues as well. You need to ask for feedback, listen to it. At the end of the day, it's free consultancy advice. Failure to actually listen to that free consultancy advice that you get from within your organisation ultimately might means you need to go and pay somebody for it. So, bringing this back to numbers, there's economic sense in listening to however large an organisation you are. You can do this with 2 people. You can do this with 200. You can do this with 2,000 and so on. The numbers keep going because it all comes down to that leadership. Leadership teams are invariably small in comparison to the rest of the organisation, but have the greatest impact. I really would encourage you to embrace this guide that's being launched today, wherever you are in the journey, because even if you're quite advanced, this is a journey, it's not a destination. There's still so much that you can learn. Now, I'm not at the Law Society of Scotland anymore since 2 weeks ago, but I want to draw upon my experience there. It's the most recent and one of the things that I'm most proud of in my career. And I'm nearly 50 now. I mean, you said nearly 40, that's wishful thinking. Of all the things I've done and achieved, the work I did chairing our Freddie group, which stands for Fairness, Respect, Equality, Diversity, Inclusion and Engagement, is probably the thing that will last in my mind. And when I go into whenever retirement finally happens, with the one thing that I think, I really made a difference to people's lives. And the story there was we were approached a number of years ago by HR, who said, we want to raise the profile of this Freddie initiative, but we don't want it to be seen as a HR issue because it's an everybody issue. And that's another important part of this leadership, is about making sure that it isn't seen as something HR doing something to the rest of the organisation. It's about it showing up in the work and every aspect of a business's activity. So I rolled up my sleeves and I put together a steering group of colleagues, most of all of whom are still on it. And the only reason people ever left that group was because they left the organisation, like I've eventually done. It started off, though, with it needing a role model. And if you're going to do this, you need to seek out your neurodivergent colleagues and create a space that is psychologically safe. And I'm going to leave other panelists to come and talk to about that. But if you have not created that psychologically safe space, you're not going to get your role models and you're not going to get people to start talking. But you really do need it. The impact of somebody, just one person standing up and talking about their experience, is incredible. If they're senior in the organisation, it can be transformative. That doesn't mean that because you're a director, as I was, and I decided to talk about my neurodiversity journey, that I was not so nervous when I did an all-colleague meeting. I was practically dancing because I couldn't keep still. And I'm almost doing it now. I'm sitting in a chair and I'm in a swivel chair, slightly swiveling around, because it does get easier, but it is still uncomfortable to talk about your own stories. I can advocate for others, but advocating for yourself, talking about your own experience, it's different. But only by showing that bravery, that leadership bravery, can you possibly start to affect change. Now, if you're fortunate enough to have neurodivergent members of your senior leadership team, then you've got your role models. If you aren't fortunate enough to have neurodivergent members of your senior team, you're probably missing out on creativity and crisis management, but that's one of the advantages of that. But you need to think about how you're going to seek out those neurodivergent colleagues that can be role models and make sure that you support them. But allies are just as important. And you shouldn't therefore decide, okay, we've got an entirely neurotypical senior leadership team, therefore we'll do nothing, because that's not a reason, that's not an excuse. You can still be an ally that creates the right space, because that's how I stood up that day. It was encouragement from other members of my senior leadership team that created that space by being my ally. The reason I did it was because at this point, I'd been sharing this Freddie group for a number of years. And when I first started to it was already there, but identify my ADHD and start that journey, I didn't think that it would sit with my own integrity and my own set of values that I would stay quiet about it. Knowing full well that we can see it in the press all the times, there's waiting lists that are knocking a decade for an NHS diagnosis, knowing that there could be people that were in our colleague community, but also as a professional body within the membership communities, Scottish listers and the wider legal sector, that were in exactly the same boat as me, but maybe frightened to speak up. So part of my story is that I did speak up quietly at first to colleagues in HR, and I got an occupational health assessment and discovered this thing called ADHD coaching, which I'll come back to, and realised that there was support, and that I didn't need to be afraid, and that actually it was likely that I had had career success and been in the position I was in, not in spite of ADHD, but actually likely because of it. But I was fortunate I was in a role that matched my neurodivergency. I then went on through occupational health and discovered this thing called ADHD coaching, and I put myself through that, and that changed the way that I managed my different characteristics and behaviours, some of which could be amplified because they were strengths, and others needed some careful routine and habit forming in order to manage. But I talked openly about that too. And the impact of that was that I had colleagues then coming to me who had had diagnosis 10 years before, but been afraid to even put it on the form with HR, let alone talk openly across the business. And it started this snowball effect. So one of the things I would advise is, if you're going to do that, be prepared actually to get some resources behind you, because the one thing that we did not do, which we had to quickly retrospectively fit in, was how to contain and manage the volume of inquiries and people that then wanted support. What were we then going to do? It wasn't floodgates argument, so don't panic about that. And most of the changes that can be put in place to support neurodivergent colleagues, as Alan has already said, make sense for everybody. For example, setting agendas and sticking to them, good time management, regular breaks. Who doesn't need a regular break? These things are free. They don't cost you anything. Things like coaching, there's government funding for. You can go through the Access to Work scheme if you can't afford it. There is a delay because applications take time and there's a lot of demands on those resources. You can self-fund. But also be prepared for colleagues that start a neurodivergency journey to discover that what they thought they initially had likely they do, because self-diagnosis is valid, despite what people in the media might like to say. People don't deliberately go out and say that they're different. They're identifying and realizing that this actually applies to me. But also, there's a co-occurrence that is very frequent. Often you'll hear the co-occurrence between ADHD and autism. That's why we have the phrase ADHD. But there's also dyslexia and dyspraxia. And the latter is something that I'm now exploring because it explains my coordination and balance, which has long been a family joke. But the less funny side of that was the bullying at school, because I was always that kid that was the last one being picked for any team, for any kind of sports. And if you chucked a ball at me, if we were in a room physically, if you chucked a ball at me, I probably wouldn't react because I really don't know how to catch it. And those things are part of that journey. But this is about talking and the storytelling, about showing to different people within the organisation that it's okay to talk openly about this. I've been a senior executive for decades. My ADHD has not stopped me from having a successful career. But what you will not see is the battle that I was having silently to keep up, to understand, to digest information that was being presented in a way. For example, turning up a senior leadership team and presenting management accounts for the first time, and then somebody whizzing around an Excel spreadsheet on a big screen, and I'm watching other colleagues follow, and I'm not following. I know I need to download that, take it away and look at it, because that's how my processing works. I process in a non-linear fashion. And most people with any form of neurodivergency tend to process in a non-linear fashion. It's what makes us great when a crisis hits, because we don't have to think outside the box. We went in the box to start off with. So storytelling. I didn't finish mainstream school. I was sent off to a special centre for the naughty kids, as it was known back then, but this was the early 90s, and we weren't talking about ADHD, certainly not in my school district. But that special centre is now a school for kids with ADHD getting the right support. I was booted out of the school where I was bullied, removed because I was the victim. Similar story to a lot of things that happen. And unfortunately, this has a common theme in workplaces too. So if you are neurodivergent, you are more likely to be bullied. And if you speak up about it, you can end up sometimes being the one that's removed, because it's easier to take out the neurodivergent colleague than it is necessarily to deal with behaviour that runs against the grain of hopefully what an organisation's values would like to be. So going back to that centre, I was sent there. I was scared to death. I was alone, frightened, feeling rejected. And on top of it all, I'm also a gay man. So at the time, I am 15 years old and I'm struggling with my sexuality. So kind of a double shame. My mental health went into free fall. I did come out of that narrowly in one piece. And I went on to have a successful life. But because I was sent there, because I was pulled out, because it was an early intervention, even though my neurodivergency wasn't picked up at that point. Now, success to me might be very, very different to anyone that idealises a billionaire. I'm happy. I make a difference to people's lives either by individually coaching them or doing my part to make sure there's access to justice, proportional regulation in the legal sector, or leading an organisation properly. And I'm quite pleased with where I've got to. I'd have liked to have done it without the battle that came with trying to be fitting into a neurotypical working environment with a neurodivergent brain. So I was sent to the centre, and then over the following 30 years, I was diagnosed with one mental health condition after the next, full of pills that never worked, re-diagnosed again and again and again, until I finally was told, we don't know what's wrong with you. But there never was anything wrong with me, ever. I was just wired differently and struggling to fit into a world that wasn't designed for me. No one ever explored neurodiversity. And that's where therapy had failed. And it was easier to drop me up than it was to explore even deeper. I'm not bitter. I was angry at first, but I'm not anymore. And that's because I took all that emotion and I went and turned it into doing what I love the most, and that's working with people. And this is going back to this leadership point. I use my instinctive high emotional intelligence that comes with ADHD, along with the empathy and the ability to harness that mood shift in a room in nanoseconds. So Last year I spoke at 2 events. Both frightened me. I've mentioned one, which was the all-colleague event. The other one was when I was invited by the Legal Neurodiversity Network to speak to the profession in an online environment where I have no idea how many people were going to turn up. I still get nervous, as I said. But I was going to talk, this was the first time I ever spoke really publicly and openly as I am today. And I told myself, well, you're never going to be a chief executive now, are you? Because of my own inbuilt shame that had come from all those years ago when I was 15 and I was taken out of school and etc., the story I've just told. But I speak to you today as of 14 days ago as the chief executive of one of the legal regulators in England and Wales. And I do this alongside my coaching and consulting practice. I am an ADHD and ADHD executive coach to an organisation called ADHD Works. And through my own personal consultancy, I work with organisations to help bring EDI to life. Everything I do now is focused on making a difference to other people's lives. And that is because of the way that my neurodivergent brain is programmed. So, in other words, I'm living my ideal. I feel happy and success. I have a job that provides me with the structure and routine I need for my ADHD and the freelance work that feeds my soul. And I help others unlock the potential. And I speak at events like this to show every frightened person, whether you're a teenager or approaching retirement, it's just okay to be you, to work with your brain against it, that you're not alone, that you're part of a far bigger community than you've probably ever imagined. And together, we can all make the world a much psychologically safer place than it maybe has been for a lot of us by working together. So my appeal to leaders who believe they're neurodiverse is join me and be seen. So many people need to see that it's okay to be yourself and that you can have a successful career too. Check out Principle 3 of the guide. It really chimes with this. And I'd just like to end by just once again thanking Alan and the team for inviting me to speak today. And I really hope that some of what I've shared today is helpful to you on your own journeys. Thank you.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. As you well know, our journeys are not entirely dissimilar. I too did not finish school, didn't have an awful lot by way of qualifications, and some of you will have heard this story before. Ironically, I was asked not to sit my accountancy and economics exams, and later was responsible for $4 billion of assets under management for a Canadian investment manager, which I always think is quite comical because like lots of us, I was very much an applied learner. Theoretical blackboard stuff just made my eyes spin, a bit like your example of people whizzing about an Excel spreadsheet. And I too took a decision, actually, following a mental health breakdown in my previous job, to disclose. And it was a very bold thing to do at the time. There were no people really in my position doing so. But it brought a huge sense of relief. And I felt able to just be myself and not have to cover up for all the things I'm meant to be brilliant at as a leader. And then coming to Mindroom a little over 3 years ago, I just thought I have nothing to lose. We're a neurodivergent organisation. If I don't out myself, then I'm a bit of an imposter. So I did that, and it was warmly welcomed, as you'd expect. But that is not the universal experience. And we know from research from the likes of Birkbeck, City and Guild, CIPD and others, there is a huge gap between population occurrence of people who are neurodivergent and workplace disclosure. And I do want to underline, disclosure is not the goal. It is not to say everybody must bare their soul. But if you do have a workplace that feels safe for you to do so, just as Paul has experienced, just as I have experienced in various roles, it does enable those who feel able to speak a little bit about their own journey. And this is all, as we say, predicated on how can we thrive in the roles we're in, lean into the stuff that we're particularly good at and that we over-index in, and where needed, seek support for other things. I often joke in Mindroom, don't ever put me in charge of project delivery. I love coming up with snazzy ideas, but I do not enjoy seeing them through. And I'm easily distracted. It reads a little bit like my school report, which was talks too much, easily distracted and distracts others. I should never let my kids see that, by the way, because now they think they've got an out, but there we go. Story for another day. All right. Well, listen, enough ramblage from me. I'd like to come to Jill now, because we have touched on psychological safety as this conversation has unfolded. And just as with leadership, without that, it is hard to make progress. And you've done a terrific amount of work, Jill, at Baillie Gifford to help create the conditions that enable people to feel safe, specifically around neurodiversity. So let me come to you to just say a few words about that.
Yeah, thank you, Alan, and thank you, Paul, for sharing your stories so beautifully. I am an editor at Baillie Gifford. That's kind of my day job. But my other role is I chair our neurodiversity network, which is an employee resource group. There are about 8 or 9 different resource groups within Baillie Gifford. We've got just under 2,000 staff, and we all work together. We work on a kind of our own areas, and then we kind of fit into the bigger D&I group and work together on different things. So I was just going to say a bit about my journey as well, because it's quite wrapped up with the journey that Baillie Gifford's gone on. I actually did fine at school. I did really well. And that was because I was autistic. So the school was kind of like my safe space in a way, because I could do the work, and the teachers were quite pleased that I could do the work. So, I didn't get picked on in that sense. But being autistic, there was kind of differences in social communication and things that I found really hard. And I always felt that I was an outsider and I didn't quite get it. And what was the secret code that everybody else seemed to have, that they understood what was going on, and I just was kind of 2 steps behind. Now I'm 50 now, 51 actually. And so when I was at school, neurodiversity wasn't a thing. Autism was something that boys had, a small group of boys had, and nobody for 1 minute thought that I was autistic, because I was performing at school, but socially and emotionally I was in a bad place. And I kind of got through it, went to university, and I went on to do a PhD. And at that point I had autistic burnout. I realized that's what it was now, but I didn't know at the time. And so I kind of crashed and burned, and I came home, and I kind of fell into the financial services industry, just because that's such a big part of Edinburgh. And I started doing my job, and I had children, and with my second child, he is also autistic, and we went through the discovery process and the diagnosis process with him. And so my kind of first real interaction with neurodiversity was as a parent. I thought as a neurotypical parent going through the journey to support him. And I did wonder at times, I seemed to be able to kind of get him when others didn't. And, I kind of realized now it was because, I had that autistic lens as well. And so was able to kind of see his position. And it wasn't just that I was some great mother that could kind of understand him. So I went through that process, and when I talk about it, it's that feeling of complete aloneness. We were going through all these appointments, and what is it? Here's the problems that we're seeing. Here's all the bad things. Here's all the challenges he's facing. And, around us in the playground, there's families that are celebrating, they reached this milestone, my child's doing this, they're doing that. And, we didn't have that to share. We didn't have the positive to share. It looked pretty grim at that point. And then, so he got invited to a party once, and he came to the party, had a complete meltdown, and he was never invited to a birthday party till he was much older, till he was about 11 or 12. And he knew he was being excluded. And, it wasn't that the other families were deliberately excluding him. They just, birthday parties are expensive. It's very hard to have a birthday party that caters for everyone. So the easiest thing was not to invite him. But he felt that aloneness. We felt that aloneness because even in the playground, my eye always had to be on him and keeping him safe. You know, I couldn't stop and have a chat with the other parents that were chatting away. So there was that feeling of aloneness. And then you came into work, and my team were aware of what was going on in the background and were supportive. But it was a very small group of people that knew what was going on. And about this, I'd gone through, we'd got his diagnosis, and it was about 5 years later when our HR department ran a series of events called Wider Horizons, and they brought different speakers in who weren't maybe people you would normally associate with business. And we had Sarah Hendricks come in for a session, and she talked about being autistic. And even then, you know, some of the things she said, I was like, oh yeah, I can kind of see that in me. But I always had that, I'm not autistic enough, you know, because my version of autism didn't completely match their version of autism. But at that event, I found myself sitting next to somebody who worked physically quite close to me in my department. And we had that kind of conversation. Oh, why have you come? Oh, well, I've got an autistic son. Oh, so have I. And we kind of had that moment of realization that this just wasn't something that was ordinarily talked about in the workplace. So we kind of started off with baby steps, and we had like an autism support group. And that was initially a group of parents that came together for coffee and chat about 3 or 4 times a year. And we just talked about our journeys and gave each other a bit of support and kind of started that. And then Baillie Gifford did something, and it's kind of that storytelling aspect, probably one of the things that I would say that's been most important for the sort of neurodiversity journey at Baillie Gifford, was we had a partner, one of our investment partners, stand up, and he wrote a piece for our internal intranet saying that he had depression, and sort of talking about his journey with depression and how he'd still been able to be a partner. And that was the first time that anybody senior had really kind of said, this is me, you know, this is who I am. And that had such a big impact. And we decided at that point, Baillie Gifford had set up a diversity group, and that we had a few of the first networks had already started, that we wanted to kind of have a workplace where neurodivergent employees and families, you know, felt like they belonged, they didn't feel alone, they could share their experience and be supported. And so we set up the network. So the network is 5 years old today, not today, but this year. And kind of this sort of psychological safety aspect of it, I suppose that really hit home for me when I went to get a diagnosis. So I was covering a different job role for a bit. One of my colleagues had left, and I was kind of standing in for him. And while the role was ostensibly the same, it was quite different, and it didn't play to any of my autistic strengths. It involved a lot of chasing people over the phone, and kind of one of the ways that I work best is maybe, you know, kind of handling things myself, kind of thinking things. I'm an editor. I like to think things through on paper, reflect, and kind of do things that way. But I could do none of that in this role. And I was trying really, really hard. And I was succeeding. Outwardly, I was succeeding. But it was at a huge personal cost. And my mental health plummeted. I was in the toilet. And funnily enough, what kind of made me kind of think, actually, you're autistic, you know, that's kind of your explanation for why things aren't going so well, was I attended a webinar on ADHD, and there was a picture, somebody had shared a picture of their wardrobe, you know, that kind of big pile of clothes on the floor. And I was like, oh my goodness, that is me. That chaos, that kind of, oh, I can't find anything, the search for keys, that's me. And, you know, so there must be something to this. This is not just kind of autism. But autism was the thing that I most closely felt related to me. And so that's where I went to get an answer. And I think I often get asked, do diagnoses matter? And yes, they do. And it's not about having a label. It's about understanding yourself, because I had almost 50 years of kind of telling myself I was stupid. Why am I wasting all this time looking for keys? My husband would say things like, well, if you had a place for keys, it would be easy, and kind of little comments like that, you know, they were meant out of kind of love and care, but they didn't come across as that. And so, that kind of rejection, kind of that feeling of always being on the outside, of not quite getting it, even though I knew I was performing perfectly at work, these things kind of really held. So when I got a private diagnosis, because I was just that, I need to know. I can't wait for however long for somebody else to tell me, is this the case or not? And I really respect anybody who doesn't go for diagnosis and is able to self-identify. But for me, it was important to have that diagnosis just to reduce the imposter syndrome. So I kind of got my thing, and I came in and I spoke to my manager. And I think this was what really kind of triggered the kind of importance of psychological safety, because even me, who was part of a network, who was chairing a network, who I knew my manager, I'd seen how he'd supported other colleagues with other issues. So I knew I was going to get a safe reception. But my goodness, how difficult was that phone call? It was during COVID, so it wasn't face to face. It was kind of over a Zoom call to kind of say to him, look, I think I'm about to get a diagnosis and I need help because I can't do this role because it's killing me. And that really kind of shaped what I think we were doing in the network, because we were at that stage, we were also looking at how we could support people who were waiting for a diagnosis, because it's already been said, certainly in the UK, it's a huge long wait. And we found that people would come to the network, but they didn't want to say, because they didn't know if they qualified, and they didn't know if their voice could be heard. So I think we've been very careful to kind of try and make sure that everyone's voice matters, whether you're an ally, somebody who's interested. It's about bringing people together to create that safe space. Now, a network is one way to do it, but it's only a kind of pocket within an organization. You can have a really great safe space in your network, and I think and hope that we do. But then if that doesn't translate to the kind of outer realities of your day-to-day life, then that psychological safety is gone. So for me, psychological safety is kind of the litmus test, really, of whether your organization is working, whether it's being neuroinclusive. There's a book by Ludmila Preslova, I think it is, called The Canary Code. And she talks about neurodivergent people being kind of the canaries in the organization. They're the ones that are likely to experience the ill effects of everything kind of first. They'll be the ones that kind of notice that things are not quite right. And, I think I'd love to be a canary, but I don't want to be a dead canary. So I think one of the things the network does is, it's taken time. It's about building trust. If people hear kind of like the microaggressions from their teammates, they're not going to be able to open up and be safe. The comments like, we're all on the spectrum, aren't we? And, ADHD diagnosis, isn't it a bit of a fad? There's another celebrity that's done it. And these sort of comments don't help and can completely destroy what a company's doing. So it's about collectively doing something as an organization, having these values of including everybody, about thinking about the impact of policies and procedures and how they might land if your brain's a bit different. So yeah, kind of lost my train of thought there. But I think, so when I went to my manager and he said, oh, that's great, right, okay, what can we do to help? And it's like, oh, well, I don't know. I've kind of got by for the last 40 odd years. Now, some of the things I already had in place, but I think one of the things that was really helpful for me at that stage was I got some coaching, and that really helped to kind of think through what the issues were. There are other things that we've done as an organisation. We have personal manuals, and that's because we found people found it really difficult to have to keep sharing your story. We've got some, now the idea came from somebody who works a lot on projects, and she was finding that, you know, every time she started a new project with new people, she kind of had to kind of out herself as autistic, and she didn't want to have to keep doing that. So the personal manuals for us is about sharing about how we work best, and, you know, how we can interact with one another, and kind of explaining some of the maybe not obvious things. So I have facial blindness. So I often have conversations with people and I think I have no idea who you are. And you're just having to kind of get through and kind of, it'll come to me later, you know, but because I can't kind of picture in my mind who people are, I assume most people have got a kind of stack of photos filed away in their brain somewhere, that when you meet somebody, it pops up and goes, oh, that's Alan Thornborough, I've seen him before. But for me, I can, you know, I can see somebody in a meeting, be introduced to them in a meeting, and then I can walk past them in the corridor like the day after and have no idea who they are. And that can be really difficult. So it's, you know, that my personal manual allows me to say that and say, don't be offended if I blank you. It's just my brain hasn't registered. Speak to me. And actually, I find people's voices are more likely to trigger that kind of, oh, that's who that is. So it's about increasing understanding and finding lots of ways to do that, to feel safe. You know, policies are great, and you need the policies and you need the leadership, but you need the whole organisation to do the psychological safety.
Thank you, Jill. I appreciate all that you've shared there. And your story is very consistent with so many of the parents and carers that we support, where, you know, they begin working to unblock whatever is difficult for the child in their lives, and soon begin to identify with patterns of processing and, you know, experiencing the world. And something you said, I think gets right to the heart of everything we're talking about today, is understanding
I think we might have lost Alan for one moment. But thank you, Jill. I think he was touching on that with the parent and carers we have supported, both through coming through our direct help and support services and within the workplace. We can really echo your experiences. So I think it's been very helpful for you to kind of share that and really highlight the link to that psychological safety.
Yeah, and I don't know if I'm really allowed to share this yet, but one of the things that we're doing is we're going to support Mindroom in delivering a project where you're going to be looking at the workplace experiences of parents and carers, and I'm really excited about that. The fact that, you know, this kind of data is going to be captured, and I think everybody within the neurodivergent community realizes that there are issues and challenges that we face in the workplace as parents and carers. So it's going to be great to kind of get that documented and be able to kind of do something positive from it. So absolutely. I look forward to that.
Thanks, Jill. Well, hilariously, I got kicked out there, and just as Paul spoke about staying calm in a crisis, I think I'm okay. Great. Thank you so much for coming back to join us. It's really good to see so many of you on this call, as I say, and we're grateful for you taking the time out. I noticed just in scanning the chat earlier, will this be recorded? Absolutely will be, and we will circulate that after this event as well, along with the copy of the guide. So let's get cracking then. So the third principle, I say third, they're numbered in a different manner on the guide itself, but they're not linear. They are circular, and we always keep learning more about safety, about leadership, and about inclusion as we sort of go round and round. But the final section I wanted to speak to is about creating an inclusive culture. Now, there are lots of things you can do, but we have pulled 5 kind of points out in particular that feature as part of the guide, and also just good practice that we often would advise employers to embrace as well. And they are policies and procedures. They do have a place, and you know, when we talk about things like disclosing, first of all, I need to know that information is safe, but you know, what happens next? It's almost akin to a diagnosis. That can be very affirming in lots of ways, but what now? So that's an area that will cover training, information, and resources. Unless we raise awareness and normalize the conversation about neurodiversity, we're not going to go very far. So, you know, training and building awareness at an organizational level is a key part of what you can do to build a more inclusive culture. We heard a little from Paul around leadership and the, you know, importance, and Jill, of senior champions in a business. And leadership is at all levels, of course, across organizations, but there is something that is enabling about somebody in a senior position who is willing to role model and share their story. Accessibility, both digitally and physically, lots you can do in this space as well. And then, as Jill spoke about and has done a terrific amount of work on employee engagement in voice, there is strength in numbers. This is still a stigmatized and stereotyped topic, and there are lots of reasons that are generally underpinned by fear as to why people don't feel comfortable talking about their own experiences and how they see, experience, and process the world. And these include things like negative repercussions with line managers and colleagues. It's almost back to the topic Paul spoke about of being picked last for football. Me too. So there's lots you can do there as well. So let's get into some of this. Jill, I will come to you in just a second because you have just spoken, so rest your voice. Paul, perhaps you can just say a little bit more about senior champions. You obviously took that decision to talk about your own experience in the Law Society. I wonder if you've got any advice on how to create those conditions. Is there more that we can do to help senior people step forward? Because I suspect there are risks inherent in that from a perceived point of view. What more can you share on that topic?
Yeah, I think there's 2 aspects to it. There is, let me start with the personal one. It's about building your own resilience and confidence. If you're in a senior position and you're neurodivergent, you're not there by accident. You've already proved that you're good at your job. When you get a diagnosis, or you first start the journey for a diagnosis for any neurodivergent condition, that is when the condition starts. That is who you are. You've been wired that way since birth. So you can't detach the position you're in from your neurodivergency. They are one and the same. Now, for trying to find that inner confidence can be quite challenging. What I say to clients when I'm coaching is, if you think that would mean that your career was limited in that organization by speaking out, if you think it would stop you from getting a job in another organization because of speaking up, ask yourself the question, is that where you want to work anyway? Because what you can now see in the likes of Mindroom, Bailey Gifford, and I could name a lot of other organizations, firms, a big firm like Adelshaw Goddard, global firm that set up the Legal Neurodiversity Network, there is a home for us. So ask yourself whether you're in the right condition. I'm going to steal something from Leanne Maskell, who founded ADHD Works, who I coached, and also who trained me on both ADHD coaching and ADHD coaching. And that is, if a flower starts to wilt, you change its environment. You don't blame the flower. And I think that really, really does apply. In terms of how organizations can create the safer space, obviously I had a different experience at the Law Society where I felt I could speak up. And that's the only experience I can draw upon. What made me feel I could speak up? It was a process. It was that initial conversation with somebody in HR who was welcoming and got me the occupational health assessment. It was then the conversation with my line manager, which was the chief executive at the time, about how they saw it. And the signals and signs and body language that came from them, as much as what they actually said, was always a little bit of surprise. I did get an initial reaction of, I don't think you don't have ADHD. And you're like, well, you don't really know what's been going on inside my head. Once you got over, but it was well-meaning, but once you got over that, it was that permissiveness and a willingness of my senior colleagues, most of them anyway, about being prepared to listen and learn. And it's that learning point. You know, I know this isn't a sales pitch for Mindroom, but Mindroom has all this information. It is a journey. I've just sat here listening to Jill, and I'm biting things down and things that I'm going to go away and look up, because every time we do this, we all learn something new. And we can take that away. And if we just remove this idea that neurodiversity or any form of inclusion is a destination, it would be lovely if it didn't matter anymore and we're in this wonderful world where everyone could just be themselves, but probably not in my lifetime. And just focus on that journey and that education, that there's always something new you can learn. There's always more resource you can tap into. And because everyone is different, going back to the brain and the fingerprint analogy from Alan, then you need a toolkit. So what worked for me won't necessarily work for those of you that are on this call today. And I would repeat also what Jill said, and Alan has said, just because I've spoken out doesn't mean anyone should feel under an obligation to do it. I was talking from an organisational perspective. But those are the two reflections I'd give you, Alan, on that.
Thanks, Paul. I love that. If a flower starts to wilt, change its environment, not the flower. That's certainly been present in my life, and I suspect others of us on this call as well. So we spoke there a little bit about education. Jill, we've obviously worked very closely with you and Bailey Gifford on that. And again, mindful, this is not about you must contact Mindroom immediately, although that is available. But I'm curious, what practical difference has that made in your experience? So rewind a little bit, set up the neurodiversity network, really on the strength of being parents and carers with common cause. That's obviously become a real voice for change and influencing that understanding and listening that Paul spoke about. But the role of training and education, could you say a little bit more about how has that really affected change on the ground?
I think we need to think about education and training kind of in a wider sense. So it's not just about putting your staff on a webinar like this or delivering training. It's about listening to employee voices. It's about talking to other organizations. So same way Paul is learning things from today, so am I. You know, Mindroom, we're lucky enough to kind of work with Mindroom and some other partners within Scotland, and every time we get together and have a round table, I come away with so many ideas and things that I think, oh yeah, that's worked really well, or I've learned from the experience of others that haven't worked quite so well. And it's that kind of learning experience and being open to kind of what's going on in the environment and kind of taking the lead from your neurodivergent colleagues or family members or allies, but not kind of laying it all on them. I think kind of the mistake we made at the beginning was kind of thinking as a network. Now, when we started, we had maybe 10, 15 people in our network and thinking we had to do all the work. We had to make Bailey Gifford inclusive. We had to train everybody. And that is just not sustainable. We are all people with individual roles that we're doing, and any kind of employee resource group stuff that we're doing is on top of our day-to-day stuff. So it's about kind of making sure that the people that are being your champions and mentors and are involved in diversity and inclusion are given time and space to do it, but also having that budget and being able to access external help. So I think there's a lot of nonsense out there when it comes to neurodiversity, and there's a lot of people that it's the kind of in thing. So they're suddenly offering training webinars. But I think it's looking for things like, Mindroom, where there is neurodivergent, a lot of it is informed by neurodivergent people within the organization and the people that they're working with. So making sure that your training providers have lived experience and have, a depth to them. And I'm not saying that you have to be neurodivergent to be able to offer neurodivergent training, but you have to have kind of studied it, and kind of, if you're going in to advise other people, then you do need to watch that the people have that depth and understanding and proper training. Because I think, so one of the things one of the kind of offerings Baillie Gifford has got is we use First Psychology, who kind of offer that kind of safe space where, if there's issues in my life, I can phone them up and ask for some counselling. And there was this perception that it wasn't very neuroaffirming, that it was CBT and only CBT. But actually, when we looked into it, there was more. And I had a really successful kind of 6 sessions with somebody, and she wasn't autistic, she wasn't neurodivergent. But when things came up and I was kind of explaining my experience as an autistic person, talking about sensory overload, she listened to me and she understood what I was saying, and she had the tools in her toolkit to adapt. So it's about speaking to the right people sometimes when it comes to training, and not, I mean, we've used Mindroom, but there will be other organizations. So we identified a need around burnout within the organization, some of our neurodivergent staff. And so we spoke with Nellie and Aileen, and we kind of talked about what we thought we needed, and then Mindroom kind of input what they thought would be the best. And we worked together to find something that was tailored to us. And I think it's that ability to kind of take the general and tailor it that's really helpful.
Alan, could I add a comment, please?
You sure can, Paul. Please do.
It's just on picking up on Jill's point about picking the right training provider. We all had a break at an hour. And what I think the quickest telltale sign that training provider has no neurodivergent lived experience is when they want to do a 3-hour training session with no breaks.
Well, that is good. That is good to hear. Thank you. And it wasn't for selfish reasons either. I just thought it's probably a good natural moment for us to just dust ourselves down, because we have covered a lot of ground actually, and a lot of this is very heartfelt. And again, I'm grateful to you both for sharing your experiences, because there's a lot of identification with that. Jill, you began to very helpfully veer into areas like employee engagement and voice, and I think we've spoken quite a bit about that. But what I find, I think without exception at an organizational level is, we have better role modeling, we have more, storytelling through organizations. Yes, training and awareness is more than kind of formal training courses, but that does naturally lead to more people feeling comfortable to talk a little bit about their own experiences. And one thing I touched on earlier was, so what next? And we're very familiar with the world of reasonable adjustments. Again, in Utopia, that isn't required because we design in for everybody. But let's just hold that thought at the moment. Once people perhaps start to step forward, confide in a colleague, in a network, in HR, in a line manager or whatnot, can you say a little bit more, both of you, about the role of effective policies, and something that I think some may be familiar in the call with, disclosure pathways? What actually happens next? If I confide in you, I trust you with this actually quite personal information, what will you do with that? Who would like to say a little bit more on that?
I'm happy to give Jill a quick breather. So invariably, you'll have some people come to you with a diagnosis, some without a diagnosis, and they'll likely be a conversation about that. The first thing I'd say is, and this is even with all my coaching training, is we're not medical professionals. Don't try and be a medical professional. It's not your place to diagnose someone. If somebody comes to you and talks to you and thinks they've got ADHD or autism, and you think, actually, I think you're ADHD, or you don't. It's not really your place to offer your opinion on their diagnosis. Let them be let them present as they are, accept them as they are, how they talk about it. That's the permissive, psychologically safe space. Talk to them about the options that are available. Some people may have had some really terrifying experiences with occupational health, especially if they're sort of my age. They'll have been through different chapters. So they might be a bit afraid about that. There'll be aspects that they won't know the answers, is the first thing. So even the most neuroaffirmative employer will always ask you, oh, what do you need? What reasonable adjustments do you need? If you're at the beginning of the journey, you don't know what you want to advocate for. You've spent a life masking and trying to fit in, to then suddenly go, oh, what do you need to change? In itself can be quite overwhelming. So it's finding a way to move forward. There is coaching. Jill talked about her experience of coaching, mine too. It was transformative. And I ended up deciding to go and be the other side of that conversation. There is funding available. So this is where size does not matter. Access to Work will fund ADHD coaching whether or not you can afford it. Yeah. It's not based on your turnover. So those things are available. But when you're having these initial conversations, if you suddenly throw all this at someone, you're going to overwhelm them. Similarly, if you buy them lots of books, I've still got about 10, 15 books that are still in cellophane wrappers from well-intentioned people that probably were never going to get round to reading. So just take it at their pace and just accept them as they are, talk to them about what their options could be, and working through that with them. Jill?
Thanks, Paul. Jill, yes.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Paul has said. And I think that's, you come from there, but then you have to have the procedures, you have to have the pathways in place. So when I spoke to my manager, he spoke to HR, and HR's response was, speak to the network. Here's a link to the National Autistic Society, and here's a link to Access to Work. End of story. And so a lot of my role as the chair of the Neuroinclusive Network involves kind of speaking to people about these sort of kind of answers and saying, not really helpful. I was the chair of the Neurodiversity Network, and I had spoken to my colleagues about it. A link to a website, I think, if you typed autism in the UK, that's the first thing that would come up in a Google search. That's really not kind of aiding my journey in any way. And it wasn't that there weren't pathways there, but Baillie Gifford's approach is very person-centered. So, there's kind of been maintaining privacy has kind of been the kind of key thing. So, HR didn't kind of say, 6 people came to us this month saying they're autistic and they need some support. So it's about making it clear to everyone what support your organisation has, how you can access it, and making sure that it is available without gatekeeping. So you don't have to wait for a diagnosis. So, for example, I'm an editor and I use the software Grammarly to help me, and anybody in my firm can request Grammarly to help with editing, or, kind of checking their work for spelling mistakes and errors, and just being able to kind of take off that cognitive load and support somebody. They don't have to say, I want it for X, Y, and Z purposes. They just request to systems, I want this. Okay, there it goes. And so I think being able to know what the pathways are, and one of the things that we've had to think about was there's lots of people doing great things in the organisation. So how do you make people aware of all the things that are going on? You don't want to have to go and tell systems you're dyslexic, I'd like some software, then go to HR, then go to occupational health. So it's about finding a way to kind of reduce the burden on the employee.
Thanks, Jill. Well, we've covered a lot, as I see, but perhaps just to pick out one topic in particular you mentioned there, Jill, about being person-centered. We are all entirely different, and that is naturally occurring. And just because, you know, somebody may share the characteristics of one particular neurodevelopmental condition does not mean that will present the same in another. And frequently they co-occur as well. And there is high likelihood that, you know, we will present completely differently. So putting the individual first, being strengths led, is always going to be a good approach. I think we're about 21 minutes past 11. We do want to get you away by 11:30. I know many of you will have other meetings to go to. This is just the start. We encourage you to use this guide to go forward and prosper and all of that. But I will come now to Helene, if I may, just to say some summary remarks in terms of what you have heard. And then we will thank you for your time and let you get on with the rest of your day. Helene, thanks.
Yes, thank you so much, Alan, for taking us through this discussions, and thank you so much, Jill and Paul, for sharing your stories. In my mind, in my own summary, I have a very strong picture of the importance of having a journey in your mindset when you talk and think about neurodiversity. On an organizational level, we have learned here today, it's a journey for the organization to learn and understand, to be a psychological safety organization, to be able to have role models telling their stories, for colleagues to be supportive, to be brave. It's also a journey to be an organization that can be brave. And if you are brave, it can lead to change. And I think it's also important what I think Paul was the first one to mention, that if you have some experience of neurodiversity, you cannot think you have every answer. I mean, it's not one easy solution. Everyone is on their own way, and you have to learn each individual in this personal centered way of thinking. So that's the journey on an organizational level, that you have to learn and understand, be brave, have the psychological safety to succeed. And on a personal level, I think we all were very touched by Jill and Paul's stories, and we could hear how neurodiversity on a personal level is a journey that comes with struggle. When you cover up, you have maybe experienced shame, you often feel excluded, the complete aloneness that I also share experience of, burnouts, bullying. That's a part of a journey that people also need to understand to be supportive. And that is also a personal experiences that makes the psychological safety in the organization so important. So I think that is the answer, a bit of the answer to why psychological safety is so important. And finally, I would like to add about storytelling and telling people who you are. It's important that you don't have to motivate your existence or motivate your right to be included. You need to get the right circumstances, the right environment to contribute, to live your life, to grow, to succeed. And of course, if you share your story, if you're a role model, if it's a brave, safe organization, that means you could also help others and learn the organization and your colleagues what is the best thing to do. But I would also like to add that storytelling needs to lead to what Jill mentioned. You have also put resources to this. It cannot only be on an individual level that you tell your story, but you are brave on yourself. Support from your colleagues, it's nice, but the employer also needs to put resources to this kind of work. And if everyone can succeed and do this together, I think we could have really successful organizations and personal individuals with the potential to be themselves. So thank you so much for today, and I was really happy to be part of it.
Thank you, Helene. Really appreciate that. A few very, very quick personal reflections for me. We don't need to think outside the box because we're already outside of it. That struck me, Paul. Understanding ourselves through this journey and being person-centered, I think, is really what it comes down to. You know, we're all humans, we are all different. We all see and process the world differently, and that's exactly how it's meant to be. And it's the very stuff in the environment that we operate within, in any business, charity, part of government or organization. We need to be creative to see around the corners that others can't see, and that depth of experience is already in your organizations. Finally, be the flower. So if you're not being nurtured and watered where you are, then maybe that's a reflection for you to consider as well about what could you do to change your environment. That doesn't mean leave your jobs, by the way, but that is an option too. But maybe you can be part of the change. So listen, thank you very much all for joining. Particular thanks due to our speakers, Paul, Jill, Helene. Can I also say a huge thanks to Nellie behind the scenes and Aileen, who is on the call as well. They've put a huge amount of effort in, not just to this event, but to developing, coordinating and delivering the guide. As I mentioned, I was very excitable by the prospect of it and the creativity around it, less adept at actually delivery of it. So huge thanks to my colleagues on that respect. And very finally, to all of our partners who participated, Prince Couples Foundation, Baillie Gifford, and many more on this call and far beyond. You've been great.